Yes. Well, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Hello. Thanks for those who are here in the Great Hall, and good morning to those who are joining us online. My name is the Reverend Katherine Bush, and I'm here with Scott Walters, two of your clergy folks from Calvary, and we're going to host a little conversation today about preaching, which maybe feels a little insider baseball, but we're excited about having this conversation, the two of us, and then opening the conversation up to those of you who are here with us today. Part of what we're hoping to do over the next several weeks is really tie some of our conversations on Sundays to the Lenten Preaching Series that is unfolding Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in our pulpits as we invite these guest preachers from the community of Memphis and from the nation, really, here to Calvary. But to get started, we just kind of wanted to talk about preaching in general, what it is, what we think about it, how it's changed for us, I think a little bit how it's changed us. I know it's changed me. And also to hear your own stories and your own experiences about why you keep showing up to listen to preachers, really, at this stage in the game, because that's a choice that you're making that clearly not everyone is making. So to get us started, I actually wanted to share a poem that the title of it is How to Be a Poet, but I think you could really sub in How to Be a Preacher. It's by one of our canonical poets that both Scott and I turn to a lot, Wendell Berry. So, How to Be a Poet. 1. Make a place to sit down. Be quiet. You must depend upon affection, reading, knowledge, skill, more of each than you have. Inspiration, work, growing older, patience, for patience joins time to eternity. Any readers who like your poems doubt their judgment. We'll get back to that. 2. Breathe with unconditional breath the unconditioned air. Shun electric wire, communicate slowly, live a 3-dimensioned life, stay away from screens. Stay away from anything that obscures the place it is in. There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. 3. Accept what comes from silence. Make the best you can of it, of the little words that come out of the silence, like prayers prayed back to the one who prays. Make a poem that does not disturb the silence from which it came. So with that as our opening place to begin, how to be a poet, how to be a preacher, and why we're still at it at this stage in the game. So here we are. Good morning.
Good morning.
What do you think about preaching these days?
We could talk all day about that poem, and I love that you started with it. It's really rich to be reminded of. So I think I'll just barge in, pulling poetry and my story about preaching together to begin with. I think I did not grow up in love with poetry. I wasn't really a reader until I got to college. I just played the next sport all year long. And I think what I thought a poem was somebody had a really good idea, and then they said, I'm going to package it in, iambic pentameter and rhyme, and I'm going to clamp these things on the outside so it'll be this really pretty packaging for my really good idea, but I have the good idea. And the more I kind of heard poets work, it's not that way at all. It's a sense of there's this sense of discovery as the poet kind of steps off. I'm going to try to describe this thing and see if it takes me into this new place and a new understanding. And you can kind of, in the poems that are most alive, there's a sense of discovery. And I think in the Wendell Berry, don't trust the opinions of people who think your poems are good. Listen to this silence where words might not go. And that resonates with me with regard to preaching, that moves me to preaching. There's not a sense that, it's more a sense that I'm standing over here, maybe the preacher's standing and just gets a glimpse of something beautiful over here and is trying to tell you, I kind of got a glimpse of something over here and I want you to know about it.
Right.
but there's no sense that the preacher has fully comprehended or apprehended the thing and has it under control in the sermons that are most alive. So that's a little bit of how that strikes me, and I wonder if, I know you love poetry too, I wonder why did you choose that poem?
Well, I was thinking a little bit about, we've been talking as we've been kind of approaching today in today's conversation about both of us connect poetry and preaching, and there's a whole other conversation next week for you to look forward to with folks talking about poetry. Hal Crenshaw and Bill Craddock are going to be talking about that, so come back for that. So not to stay too long in that place, but I think there is a sense of like where you thought like somebody just like you like waited for inspiration and then you sat down and wrote a poem. And I think when I was in 7th grade, that's what I thought. And again, like that there was some magic to it and that it had to rhyme and things like that. And it turns out that's not really how it works. And the same for preaching, that you can't necessarily like wait for inspiration to come because Sunday's coming whether you feel it or not, right? Like there's a routine and a rhythm and a discipline to it, and just kind of staying engaged, staying open, keep reading, to keep coming back to the conversation with the text and with thoughtful people and with other good readers and other good writers, and then to stay open. And like you said, to kind of like, I've kind of got my arms halfway around this. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it results in a half-baked sermon. But sometimes it allows for that space to say, who could say we've really got our arms around any of it? So here, let me give you a little glimpse of what I'm working on, and maybe you're working on it too, and we can all work on it together. Is closer.
And here's the other thing that feels like it's the opposite of that. If there's this openness to something I can't exhaust the meaning of, or whether it's a passage or an image, there's also a sense that in a sermon that's effective, there's great discipline. Great discipline. Once I've had a sense that, okay, I think this is where we need to go. This is what's calling to us out of the passage to wrestle with. So Ardell is a brilliant editor because she smells.
Walking in the room right now.
She can smell when I've started and I've just taken a detour. She's like, it doesn't mean I've completely understand what the sermon's supposed to do or be, but there's this irony that there needs to be this openness, a lack of control, and yet a great discipline once you've taken a path to say, we're going to stay here.
Right.
It's that particular.
And I think just to get real super concrete and to talk a little bit about what preaching is for us today here in this place, so to kind of bring us down to, okay, what is it we're doing here? So what are the elements what are the disciplining pieces? Well, here it's time. Nobody wants a 30-minute sermon unless you're at LPS, right? Like on Sundays, we don't have 30 minutes, so which is good news for me because I couldn't talk for 30 minutes. So what is the time component? Scripture is a given, right? We don't get to pick our scripture. Scripture is assigned to us by the wisdom of the lectionary. What are some of the other kind of like the guardrails or the things that are...
Well, the liturgy brings us scripture. The liturgy also just brings us, it's embedded.
Right.
The sermon here is embedded in Eucharist usually.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And even just... If you grew up in this tradition, this might not be something that is striking to you, but the pulpit is not in the middle at the highest point in the room.
Right.
In this tradition, it was in the traditions I grew up in, and so it's not wrong. It's just in that tradition there was 45 minutes or there were 30 minutes, and it was there. So scripture's read, preacher gets a say, but we're all headed to a different place.
Right. There's a different pinnacle point.
Yeah.
Right. So let's talk for a minute about the preaching series, and because those guardrails are a little different, although they may have ebbed and flowed over the years. So people sometimes ask, like, what makes Calvary's Lenten Preaching Series a preaching series, and not a lecture series? What are the guardrails and the disciplines around that? So it's not Eucharist, right? We don't do Eucharist when we invite people in, but we do ask more intentionally. To have the guest preach on a text from Scripture, but not necessarily Christian text. So we've opened the doors over the years to non-Christian practitioners and non-Christian preachers. The time frame is different. Most folks do preach from the pulpit, but not every single one. What would you say makes it a preaching series and not a lecture series?
I think the biggest piece is responding to a text. That I don't show up in a place and just, even though they can pick the text in that one, it's not a lectionary. And I think for me, that sets it apart in a particular way. What other genre would be like that? Maybe a book review? There aren't very many genres where there's this constraint of saying, we're going to struggle with this together. I do think it's a liturgy, too. And I think Baptist churches have liturgy. I think all churches have liturgy, which is a form that also informs what we're doing. And to do something as simple as having a prelude to calm ourselves, we're intentionally setting aside, we're framing what's happening. And you don't do that in a lecture series. You have an introduction, that's similar, but I don't think there's this intentional creation of meditative space, of receptive space in people. Kristen has been working, one of the gifts we should name, I guess, of the pandemic, is that Kristen had lined up instrumentalists and musicians during the pandemic who were kind of out of work, and we could offer this thing, and all of a sudden this year we're like, that's a key component, is to have music actually center us and do what music does to us to prepare. So again, like a sermon, it can be hard to nail down exactly what it takes, but there are a collection of these things that set what happens in the pulpit or in that, and the room matters too.
Right. Yeah, I think the room matters. And it's different. It's what makes Wednesday night's conversation different. I'm thinking, too, that when I go to a lecture, there's often like a Q&A at the end, right? Or there's some other engagement with or a way of encountering the speaker. And I think, too, that piece about who Calvary's inviting, and one of the things that I think is it's my own bias, my own sense of things, is that there's a real appreciation for opening the door more and more widely to folks, saying, we want you to engage with a text. But again, my assumption is that the first non-Christian speaker would have been Micah Greenstein, but I don't know that that's true. It seems somebody in the room may be able to correct me. I'm looking at some of our actual historians and just folks who've been around for a minute. But folks from other traditions, and then even particularly folks who wouldn't say they're necessarily representative of not even just another tradition, but of any particular tradition. I'm thinking about the story that you were telling about Margaret Wrinkle's experience. You want to share that?
Yeah, I got a lovely note. So last year, Margaret Wrinkle, some of you might know her. She's a New York Times columnist based in Nashville. Beautiful writer, often about the natural world is kind of her realm, and ecological themes make their way in. So we invited Margaret to come. She wrote me this lovely note after she'd come that said, "I'm not at home in my tradition." She's Roman Catholic and some things in that, and she's partly it was I would never have been invited into a pulpit, and so there was something she was expressing that was a little bit startling to her. And Marie Howe, when she came, also had the same. She grew up Catholic, and she stepped up and was a little bit unsettled by the pulpit and the context. But both ended up reflecting back that part of the richness had to do with that. I didn't think that was a place where my voice ought to be heard. And I think it changed what they said, too. In a lecture, an expert with command of the material lets us know, and obviously that doesn't happen in sermons. But there has to be a sense, I think, of a little bit of trepidation in a sermon, a sense that we're going to discover something together. I'm going to start putting these images together, or these questions together, or these insights together, but we know that this text is bottomless in what it might produce. We've been thousands of, so it's rich when someone like that comes in and says, I didn't think I'd be at home there, but I found I had something to say in that context, which is what Margaret said. Yeah.
So speaking of trepidation, one of the things that we were reflecting on in preparation for this conversation was both of us, as we began preaching, like when we preached for the first time or early training or early experiences with preaching. So for me, I grew up in the Episcopal Church. I grew up at Holy Communion. So in Memphis with Reynolds Cheney as the most frequent voice in the pulpit, which was really fortunate for me in a lot of ways. They say that preachers essentially that are at a cores, we've really all got one sermon in us when we just variations on a theme over the years. And so I was really lucky to grow up listening to this great guy's one sermon, which was that God loves you. Because if there's one message you need to hear over and over again, that's it. I don't think that he would have said that preaching was like the strongest part of his ministry. But that was what he had to say, and that's what I grew up hearing. And it was a long time before I heard women preach, even though in my lifetime it's always been a possibility. There weren't any around here when I was growing up. And I grew up at Holy Communion, I went to Rhodes, I went off to seminary, and that's really when I started preaching for the first time, and when I first started hearing women preach. And I was assigned to this field parish in D.C. on Capitol Hill that's called St. Mark's. And St. Mark's has this very peculiar tradition. They have kind of broken apart the liturgy. They do the whole church service full through, but they lift the sermon out. So readings, liturgy of the word, gospel, skip the sermon, go from gospel to creed, table fellowship, all of that. Everybody gets up, gets a cup of coffee, comes and sits back down. The church is set up in the round, and then you preach. And then the preacher preaches for his or her assigned 15 minutes or so, and then the congregation talks for 15 minutes or so. It's called sermon seminar. And sometimes offers their own take on what you said, or they ask questions, or they give their own sermon, whatever they, you give people a microphone and look what happens. And that's where I learned to preach. That's the very first environment that I ever preached in. And I don't think that I realized it until we were talking this week, that I think it's one of the reasons that I tend to maybe kind of pre-argue a little bit sometimes in my sermons, like to offer you my rebuttal before you've even tried to argue with me.
Yeah, I'd be very curious how you would connect besides that. That's got to shape I'm terrified of just you describing that.
That's so that you sit down and everybody then says, okay, Scott.
Yeah.
It's,
no, I just want you to shake my hand and say that was a nice sermon.
Right, yeah.
But how did it affect what you said?
It was quite a pleasure when I got out of that, and that is what happened, actually. In all these other parishes since then, it's been a real delight. It's been good. It was terrifying. It was wonderful and frightening, and it made you on your game. And as a seminarian who really I didn't know what I was doing anyway.
Did it change what you wrote and said? Who knows what you would have? But were you conscious of it?
I was very conscious of it, and I think, and maybe I don't think this is a bad thing, but I think in a really good way, I thought very carefully about who was in the room.
Yeah.
Maybe too much so sometimes, like, oh, this guy, he's gonna, but maybe in some really lovely ways, like, this is what this community can hear, and my own humility might need to hear, could hear, wants to hear. I think it made me really think about, I was not preaching to strangers who I was never going to hear from.
Yeah.
I was preaching to people who I knew, who were then going to stand up and respond. And I'm making this sound like it was a real argumentative session. They were mostly very gentle. They also knew that I was getting started, but it was a very different preaching experience. And the first time that I preached a more normative sermon actually was here at Calvary, when I came home one Christmas and preached the Sunday after Christmas, a low Sunday, here. So
this brings up something I had as far as different aspects of what makes a sermon a sermon. As extreme as that is at St. Mark's, to have people lining up and weighing in on what you just said, what I heard you say, too, was I knew who was in the room. I'm conscious of who's in the room. Mm-hmm. And I realized that a sermon can still be a sermon if you did come in from Timbuktu and drop into our pulpit, but I do think there's something implicit in the form that this is an ongoing conversation. And it comes up from within a community. And for me, I found in Little Rock especially, I often had a very particular person whose politics and whose view of the world and so many things were very, very different from mine, but who I respected. And it had, and what I preached had to pass, not that I had to couch it so that it was agreed with, I just had to be fair. I have to be fair to Sam. And it was a really helpful corrective to say, I just can't make certain cheap shots here. It would hurt somebody. It would alienate someone who I actually care about, and it wouldn't help even if I think the thing I'm saying is true and that Sam is the one who needs to hear it. It's not going to get me any further down that road. And so that communal aspect, that sense I know who's in the room, that St. Mark's really made into its own liturgy, I think that's an important aspect of preaching too.
Yeah, I do. And I think it's something that I'm aware of as somebody still relatively new here, of like getting to know the community and kind of finding not just my own voice, but really what is actually our voice. And, knowing a community, it's one thing to preach your first couple of sermons, and it's one thing to be a guest in the preaching series and write a sermon somewhere else and come here and preach it, like you're saying. And it's another thing to say, I'm going to be back in the pulpit again in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Or in your case, the rhythm of, which is actually not only comforting in terms of like we can build, but it's not just a one-shot chance to say everything you ever wanted to say.
It's more conversational than you think, even if you don't get to line up at the microphone and talk back.
So you want to talk about the beginning of your preaching career?
The beginning of my preaching career?
Yeah.
My very first sermon?
Sure. But however you want to think about that.
Well, I can tell you what my very first sermon was, which is terrifying. I had never preached before, and we went off to, I might have used this in a sermon here once, but you won't remember it. When I went to seminary, came back that first semester, had not taken a preaching course. You don't do that your first semester in seminary. And so on the day before Christmas Eve, back in Siloam Springs, Father John Barton said, Scott, you want to give the Christmas Eve sermon? The day before. And I was just brash enough to say, sure. And I went to the prayer book. I have no idea why I did this, but I went to the prayer book and went to the back and went to the lectionary. And for some reason, I decided to pick B. Not year B, but like on Christmas, there are, I think, A, B, and C. So you can do like Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And I knew the story, so I had a little bit of padding there. But I anchored it on the wrong Isaiah. So literally, and this is, the whole archetypal dreams where you show up in class and you're like not wearing pants. Well, the preacher steps up and is preached on the wrong text. They read the wrong text. First time I ever stepped up, we process up and I sit down and I look and it's not the Isaiah that I was terrified. I did manage to say, elsewhere in Isaiah, and do my little piece, and that's about as much as I like to improvise, elsewhere in Isaiah. So there was a little bit of terror there the first time. How about you? Oh, you said your first one was here. I have one other one. Okay, this is another one that I did that wasn't really a sermon, but looking back, I kind of think it was. A writer and preacher named Frederick Beekner, who probably many of you know, really changed the way I think about spiritual writing, autobiography, but preaching. And Frederick Beekner had a couple of editions of his sermons that are beautiful books. And the chaplain at the evangelical school where Ardell and I went to college, Bob Azzarito, one time where there was an Easter something going on after Easter, and he said, I want you to step up and just read this Frederick Beekner sermon on the road to Emmaus. And he didn't even have me introduce it. It's a horrible thing to do, because somebody asked me if I wrote it afterwards. But, I mean, not a horrible thing to do, but it just wasn't very truthful. But so it's a beautiful sermon. And in that sermon, this is something that I stood up and said in front of a bunch of people in college. He said, "Do you understand what I mean when I say that there is not one of us who's not gone to Emmaus with them? Emmaus can be a trip to the movies just for the sake of seeing a movie, or a cocktail party just for the sake of the cocktails. Emmaus may be buying a new suit or a new car, or smoking more cigarettes than you really want, or reading a second-rate novel, or even writing one. Emmaus may be going to church on Sunday. Emmaus is whatever we do or wherever we go to make ourselves forget that the world holds nothing sacred, that even the wisest and bravest and loveliest decay and die, that even the noblest ideas that men have had, ideas about love and freedom and justice, have always in time been twisted out of shape by selfish men for selfish ends. Emmaus is where we go, where these two went, to try to forget about Jesus and the great failure of his life." And I'd never heard a sermon do something like that before. I heard wonderful sermons that were more expository, or more historical. But when Beekner made that jump into taking that story into what it means to be an ordinary human with ordinary emotions and complicated relationships and fears, looking back, that was a decade before I thought I had any interest in being a preacher. That reframed what I thought a sermon might do. Even though I can't write a sermon like that, I never will be able to. That connection was really transformative to me. The biblical stories could do something different, and preaching wasn't about explaining them. It was more about bringing their energy and their wisdom into ordinary lives like ours in ways that are...
So you're getting at this a little bit, but you grew up in a different tradition and came to the Episcopal Church, which is different from my story that I was telling just a minute ago. So how would you describe the preaching shifts and the differences that you grew up with, and where you came to? A little bit more about that.
Yeah. So it was what we'd call expository preaching. And my father was a Bible professor and a theology professor, right? So it was a little bit more like a lecture, but it wasn't a lecture. We might be going through the book of Romans. And a 40-minute sermon would not be written down. It wouldn't be a 40-minute essay or lecture. It would be, let's move through these texts, let's move through these, and we're going to make connections, and it's a really rich tradition. I mean, it's a really rich and wonderful tradition. It's just different, right? And that form, even though it formed who I was as a Christian and formed how I understood the Bible in many ways, nothing in that stirred something in me to say, I think I might want to do that. And I like teaching too. I mean, I like when we have classes here and we can do something more like that. But that was what preaching was like primarily when I was growing up. Mm-hmm. And actually, I would say, I hadn't thought about this until this moment, probably in my tradition there was a little bit of suspicion toward preaching that moved you too much. The excited preacher, the one who's got this more flowery language, is probably departing from the text in ways, and not like, we need to be anchored in what the text is saying and not be projecting. We don't want metaphors about it. We don't want to be talking about people definitely not going to cocktail parties.
Well, and smoking.
Yeah, so that's something that I really think is important and that I cling to, and also it's a very different approach to preaching. Yeah. You've given two. You've given the Holy Communion, yep. Well, in here, and St. Mark's. Was there another preacher or moment or?
So I think the other. Some of the other influences for me, so while I was at St. Mark's, when I wasn't preaching, which thankfully didn't happen all that often because I was a seminarian and I was not assigned to preach very often. But I got to hear two really great preachers who were very, very different. Paul Abernathy was the rector at the time. He's an African-American, older gentleman with a very distinctive style. And Stephanie Nagley, who she was my mentor in the parish. And she was a nurse practitioner maybe before she went to seminary. She was very intellectual, very heady, very smart, wonderful, witty. I love her to pieces. And listening to both of them, who had very distinct styles, was helpful to me as I was being formed. As I was watching and listening to them on Sundays, and then going to homiletics class, right? And then watching and listening to them, and then going to homiletics. So I think that, and Stephanie was also somebody who she had. I don't know how to describe it without making it. She's a deep faith and a healthy skepticism about it all. Is that? I'm looking at Stephen, who I don't know how to talk about. She just she could really lay out like in a very beautiful way. Like sometimes this is tricky and hard. These paths that we're asked to walk, and that was really opening.
Yeah.
For me. And the other piece that came much later is having spent, and I'm not sure I know yet what this has done to me, but spending the last 12 years at a school has probably sent my brain and rewired some pathways. And the way that I talk about stories, and the way that a chapel talk is not a sermon, and the ways that we engage stories, and the way that we do that, and who I listen to, and listening to young women find their voices day after day, and be brave and be vulnerable and talk about things in their own peculiar, delightful way. I don't know yet what that's done to me, but I think probably to the good.
It's probably not finished.
Probably not finished, and hopefully, mostly, I'm sure, to the good for that.
Well, it is another piece of we're in the minority in this, that I've always gotten to preach across from another preacher in the parish. Mm-hmm. I've always been on a multi-staff parish, which is the exception, it's not the rule. And that would be interesting to me, actually, to hear more from a preacher who's got to step up every single Sunday.
Right.
And not just the sense of the telephone poles are whipping past, the Sundays are whipping past like telephone poles on the freeway, but I really benefit from you and Paul. I really benefit from hearing someone else explore a text in this community with the similar relationships. And I don't know what it would be like.
Yeah, I'm the same. And it's one of the reasons that I was drawn to come here, is to be with y'all and to be in this, to be in a community. And to not, absolutely, to be formed alongside and to listen with other people. I don't know what it'd be like to do it every Sunday. Speaking of which, one more question for us, and then we'll open it up a little bit. So you preach every other, just for those of you who maybe have noticed the pattern, maybe you haven't. So depending on holidays and Paul's traveling this week. So generally speaking, it's Scott, Paul, Katherine, Scott, Paul, Katherine. Rector privilege. Or not. Maybe it's not a privilege. Maybe it's the rector's burden. I don't know.
Depends on the Sunday.
Depends on the Sunday and the text, right. So talk a little bit about process. And we both have this, everybody has their ideal, like, this is what it's like for me when I sit down and write a sermon. And then this is what really happens. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
A little peek behind the curtain?
Yeah. So back in seminary, I went to what was the preaching conference thing? Preaching excellence something. Anyway, Fred Craddock, another different Craddock, a different wonderful Craddock, one of the best preachers in Protestantism in the church, and a great teacher about preaching. And Fred Craddock had a thing about resources. And he'd be like, this is a Tuesday commentary. You got to get to it early in the week and chew on this one. This one's a Friday. It's going to be a little more accessible. And he was really serious about it. He's like, if you're going to the Anchor Bible commentary, you need to get that early in the week because it's going to be heavy. Other things might stir your imagination in other ways. So, in the best of weeks, at the very least, I need to have read the lectionary, listened to it, been quiet long enough, as the Wendellberry sermon alluded to, to get a sense of what's going on in one of the readings that's caught my attention or annoyed me, or what did Judith McDaniel used to say, where the shoe pinches your foot. One of our preaching prophets used to say, where the shoe pinches your foot, that's what you should pay attention to in a reading. So hopefully I've got that early in the week, even if I haven't had time to sit down with a commentary. And but there needs to be some white space, and there needs to be some life in the congregation that goes into it. You know, they're all at a point in time. I'm almost always writing a sermon on Saturday when I'm preaching. So I wish that weren't the case, but it is the case. So I need to be there. It probably says a number of things, one of which is I need a deadline. And so certain things aren't going to happen until I get close. I'm not the procrastinator I used to be when I was a young person, so I don't really feel like that's a deep issue I have. But there is a certain amount of pressure toward the end of the week that hopefully on Friday, that's when I end up getting into the Tuesday commentaries usually. I'm more clear on Friday. And then hope I can make something happen. What about you?
Similar in terms of reading early and letting it sit back there. And again, preaching a little less often means I can let it sit longer. So I can read ahead and then just have it kind of sit there. Hopefully I'm just editing on Saturday, but that's when I'm reading out loud to hear and catch the things that don't work verbally or orally. One of the things that about a sermon is that it's not a written document, it's an orally delivered event. So things that you write that look really nice on a page sometimes don't come across, don't speak well. They have listened to me kvetch a little since I've gotten here. This whole printing the sermon out and having it available for y'all to pick up kind of bugs me. I will write my sermon out and preach from a full text. That is my MO. I'm happy to do that. I would do that anyway. But y'all getting it before I've delivered it, I don't know. And I appreciate the need for some people. I have a hearing aid. I appreciate the need for some people that's how and I know all about learning differences, that the person who needs the slides, the kid in the class, I'm for that. But just there's something about having it just, people who are just looking for something, if I'm talking to you, I don't know who I'm talking to. But printing it out and reading it before I've preached it kind of irks me a little bit. Anyway. I don't know who that is, so I'm not looking at anybody. But it does force you to it has to be done.
It moves the deadline.
It does move the deadline, because you got to run the copies, because you never know about the copier, is another thing. So that's a funny spot to end on. I don't want to end there, but.
No, maybe it's just worth saying that a sermon's never going to happen in an ideal context.
That's true. Yeah.
And there are going to be these weighing of, I think it's completely valid, what folks would say, it's absolutely not worth it.
Right.
Here we know that it's given people access.
Yes, and I do believe, I don't mean to critique.
No, I hear it.
It's
both of those are valid and true.
Yep, at the same time. So I would love to know why you keep coming to listen to sermons, which is not a thing that.
We're assuming you're listening.
Well,
you look interested.
You look like you're here in body, even in this conversation right now, which is particularly stunning. But when you show up, a lot of people are not showing up to listen to preaching on Sundays, much less on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays for a preaching series. So you might talk about what preaching means to you a little bit, or you might recall a sermon that you can still recall.
I have a couple of comments. In fact, I have more, but I'll be brief. I grew up at Calvary, and we've always had spectacularly rich preaching here at Calvary. And I would say that now the team we've got, with varied experience, are top of the list. And add Buddy to it. Oh, my gosh. So Friday, he starts off. And he says, love your enemies. Who you kidding? And from there he preaches this wonderful sermon on forgiveness, and you just want to write down things. And then Katherine preaches a sermon last Sunday, I guess it's Sunday week. Is that right? And I was just spellbound. And as much by your wonderful writing as I could imagine, clearly she starts as a writer. And Scott, Paul, before you, Amber was in the tradition too. Anyways, it's just spectacular. Thank you.
Who else? Something to say about preaching and why we still do it, why you still show up to listen to it? A memory of preaching? Yeah.
Some of you all may remember Johnstone Jenkins, funniest preacher I ever listened to in my life. He used to pack Calvary the Lenten Preaching Series because he was so funny, and then he would zinger you at the end. And he would walk down the aisle, and he had his aquiline nose, and he would turn sideways so that everybody, Raymond, you remember this, everybody got a profile. And he would walk down the aisle, and he would say this most hysterical Bible story, but he would say what would really happen, like with Nicodemus, or with the guy on the roof that fell through in the feast. And he said, so we're sitting around, we've got all this fancy food, everybody's on a lounge, there's grapes hanging around everywhere, and some idiot falls through the roof. He said, and along comes the bird dew and the straw and all the stuff that's up on. He said, what was that all about? And off he went. That was probably 40 years ago, and I remember almost the whole sermon. And so I think when a wonderful preacher throws something at you that's so different, like Raymond was saying, and grabs you right at the beginning, you're there, you're hooked. And just to say thank you for the printed things, we can go back and think about it, which is awesome, but different preaching styles are very difficult sometimes to hear. A lot of preachers drop their voice at a very important moment because it's intense. And the choir can't hear it. It's gone. We can't hear it. And then there's other preachers that get so excited that they go fast and fast, kind of like I talk, and they get rolling and you go, what the hell did he say? So for those of us in the choir who miss a lot because of preaching styles, and this has gone over the years, it's a great gift. And I know there are people in the Congo that can't keep up or can't hear all the pieces of it. So when you spent a lot of time creating a fabulous sermon, and then some of us would miss half of it, the printed copy is a great gift. So we do thank you for that.
Well, I want to follow up, too, on Linda Gale's. I think the whole question of humor is an interesting one, too. It's not a necessary component, but it's one way into... Our daughter at my dad's memorial service wrote a piece about the laughter that happened in our family as we were... And she said something really poignant, which was that laughter wasn't... Ardell, you might have to help me. It wasn't a diversion. It wasn't a way of releasing energy. It was actually a way of being together, and it was true to what was going on. And I think in a sermon, sometimes there's laughter that's entertaining, and sometimes there's laughter because there's a deep irony, or humor comes usually out of something that's very true about the world. Some irony, so that's another question, an interesting component in preaching. When is humor something that actually takes us deeper in a way, even if it's enjoyable, or when is it just a diversion? And I suspect that the ones you're talking about, those moments, it was both of those. It wasn't just a diversion. It was that the humor showed us something about the text, showed us something true about ourselves. So. Yeah, draws you in.
I think that's very true, that laughter piece. And as somebody who's not very funny naturally, I admire that, and I mean, I really do appreciate
true.
that. It's a gift that some people really do have. Because now you're laughing at me, not really with me. And I also want to say too, Linda, and again, I know now I'm going to have this bad rap about dogging on the paper copies, but I do think that first of all, I know that when you're sitting behind the preacher, it's so hard to listen. Just acoustically and attention-wise, it's just maybe we should put that on the list of things to work on in the capital campaign. But also, I also want to note too that one of the things that's unusual about coming to hear a sermon and coming to hear preachers is that we're coming to listen. And that's a skill that is I'm not going to say it's a dying art. I'm not going to say, oh, kids these days, they don't know how to listen. It's not to go there, but just to say that listening is its own gift and its own way of participating in what's happening. And it takes us back to the piece of the conversation about we could stand up there and preach to empty rooms, and some of us had to during the pandemic, and that is a different event and not fun. But people coming and being willing to listen and to sit still and to listen not only to the preacher, but to the prayers, to listen to the music, to listen to preludes, to listen to quiet, to listen to what sounds like not much happening. Listening is part of it, is the necessary part. There's no reason to preach if there's no listening happening. So I want to name that as well, and that's what I'm thinking about when you were talking about how much effort it takes to listen well, and knowing some folks that I know I can look at that are good people who are really good listeners, and what a gift that is, one-on-one and in a congregation. We're coming close to time, but yeah.
Just thinking about an answer to your question about what I appreciate about preaching at this stage of my life. So maybe changing your question a little bit, but I think I'm a little like Scott, and I think Heidi would probably say this too, is that I grew up in a tradition where preaching was very like you stuck to the text, and I remember commentary by my parents about various sermons, and like, well, he didn't stick to the text, and that was a no-no. But I think as I get older, I appreciate you all's approach, and that it's more poetic and more trying to connect with our current reality. And a metaphor came to me as I was listening to you all. Sometimes when you're looking at a star. And you do something where you avert your eye a little bit because the edges of your eye are more sensitive to brightness. So if you don't look right at it, you can actually see it a little better. So it made me think of it. I find at this point in my life, like actually if I look away from the text a little bit and sort of let it kind of, I wonder if that's an analogy for what you're doing. Is it sort of like you're letting it shine its light on things in a way that's different than if you just like stare at it.
Fantastic. Can we use that in a sermon?
That's lovely. I'm thinking about a friend who's one of my favorite preachers, and one of the things that he does really well is he'll lay out 2 or 3 things, and then he'll just stop, and he makes you do the work of the connecting the dots pieces. And that's what I was thinking about if I'm like kind of looking at it slantwise a little bit. Yeah, thanks. Another thought or two? Yeah.
I was thinking, as people were talking about the printed pages, I was thinking also about the recordings that we've done since the pandemic. And I'm more of a listener, and that's probably because my job requires me to listen to people all day, every day. And so the printed pages, I'm glad for people to have them because accessibility is important, but they don't do a lot for me. But I will go back and listen to the recordings over and over again, and listen at a deeper level, and I can find other things. And I think what keeps me coming back is, the difference in perspective. Sometimes, you see a text you've seen many times in your life and you think, here we go again. But then there's some, very different take on it. Like Amber in particular was excellent at giving me a very different take on a text I'd heard many times. And that's so different. When I was growing up, we went to a congregation that had one minister, and all of his sermons were the same. There were always 3 points, always the same language in the first place, in the second place, in the third place. If you missed it, you pretty much knew what he had said. So I really appreciate the diversity, of having multiple people. And sermons do stick with. I remember when I first came to Memphis many years ago, I heard Doug Bailey preach. He had a suitcase, leave your baggage at Calvary's altar. I don't know if any long-term people remember that one, but at that particular time in my life, I had a lot of baggage, and that really spoke to me, and that has stayed with me all these years. And I sometimes still, though not literally, sort of mentally leave my baggage at Calvary's altar. So.
Thank you. Thanks. Anyone else? Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to say I really enjoy the printed copies. And, well,
We're going to start. I'm keeping track. I think it's 3-2.
and I promise I don't even look at them until you get started. But you asked, if there'd been a sermon that particularly struck you. Well, I just have to go back to, I guess, what has kept me coming back to the church all these years. I've, kind of come and gone at some points. But when I was in high school, Dan Matthews was the associate at Holy Communion. And God love Eric Greenwood, I couldn't tell you one thing he ever said. Sweetest man on the whole earth, and I adored him, but I had never really heard preaching until Dan came, and because he was the assistant, he had to do chapel a lot, this was back when we would have the first grade through 12th grade, all in the church at the same time. And Dan somehow managed to speak to everybody, and I guess I remember one day he said something to the effect, people thought Jesus was crazy. I said, oh, okay. And he went on from there, and it was just for some reason, but it was the kind of crazy I wanted to be involved with. And anyway, I just, I've already counted myself so lucky to have had that introduction to preaching. So, and I love you all, every one of you.
Well, speaking of looking forward to a sermon, you're going to hear a good one today. And we appreciate y'all showing up to listen to us just prattle on about the craft and the art of it. Next week, Hal Crenshaw and Bill Craddock are going to be up here talking about poetry. And then looking ahead, we're going to have some great conversations about Room at the Inn. We're going to have good conversations about sustainability and green practices and interfaith conversations. All of these are inspired by the folks who are coming to Lenten Preaching Series, so it's going to be a great tie-in to connect the dots, and we hope that you will be looking ahead at who's going to be in the pulpit and come into those preaching events too. So thanks, y'all. Good to be with you.